Bears found a female veteran hanging off a cliff. What they did next shocked everyone. Eve George moved through the world like a specter, always present but never quite there. Known to her new colleagues at the Indiana Border Patrol Station as the Quiet Ranger, she was an enigma. Her silence wasn't from a lack of words, it was the weight of memories that left her speechless. The others knew only the surface, the quiet woman who kept to herself, always moving with precision, always blending into the background. But there was more beneath that, so much more. Before she became a Border Patrol agent, Eve had served as an Army Ranger, one of the most decorated operatives in her unit. She had been tough, unshakable, with a reputation that preceded her. Yet her last mission shattered everything. Betrayed by someone she trusted, she watched her team disintegrate, torn apart in a matter of hours. The feeling of that betrayal was something that had never left her, haunting her every waking moment. The faces of her fallen comrades still lingered in her mind, constant reminders of the price of survival. After returning home, the world felt like a place she no longer fit. The city lights, the constant noise, the people who couldn't understand. It all became too much. So she chose solitude, retreating into the dense Indiana forest where the trees stood tall like silent sentinels, and the quietness held a peace she could no longer find anywhere else. She joined the Border Patrol, not for a sense of duty, but for escape. The job was quiet, uneventful, a perfect backdrop for a woman who needed to disappear. Eve's days at the station passed like a blur. She never spoke unless spoken to, never looked for companionship, and never sought attention. The work was simple: long patrols, watching the horizon, checking the border, and it suited her just fine. Here, she wasn't the soldier who had been betrayed. Here, she was just another agent, blending into the landscape. One morning in September, Eve was given a solo mission to investigate rumors of suspicious activity near Devil's Backbone Cliff, a remote area in the eastern temperate forest. Supervisor Ryder Smith had briefed her in his usual vague manner, detailing little more than a set of coordinates and a general sense of unease about increased trafficking in the area. As always, Eve didn't question the assignment. The quiet, cold air of the forest had become her sanctuary, and she preferred it that way. Wrapped in the stillness of the early morning, Eve set out on foot. The forest was quieter than usual, the scent of damp earth hanging in the cool air. The ground beneath her boots crunched as she made her way through the woods, a rhythmic sound that matched the pace of her thoughts. Her mind was focused. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of a leaf was a potential signal, an alert. But as she walked, there was only the emptiness of the trees, their skeletal branches reaching toward the gray sky. Her body moved with practiced precision, every step purposeful. She was used to the silence, used to the weight of the past pressing down on her. But as she ventured deeper into the woods, something began to feel wrong. The air grew heavier, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. It wasn't the chill of the cold, but the sensation that something, or someone, was watching her. It was then that she saw them, strange footprints in the soft mud. They were too large to be human, the patterns too irregular to belong to any animal she recognized. Her pulse quickened, the calm exterior she'd cultivated slipping just slightly. Eve crouched down to inspect the prints more closely, instinctively reaching for the radio at her side. But before she could make the call, the air around her seemed to shift. Suddenly, she was ambushed. A sharp blow to the back of her head sent her sprawling onto the forest floor. Her vision blurred, the world spinning as she struggled to stay conscious. The noise of her attackers was muffled, like distant voices in a storm. Hands grabbed her, roughly pulling her to her feet. She tried to fight, her training kicking in, but her legs were weak, her head swimming with the effects of the blow. Her gear was ripped from her, her weapon discarded and tossed aside. They bound her wrists with zip ties, the cold metal biting into her skin as she was dragged toward the edge of the cliff. She tried to speak, tried to demand answers, but her throat was dry, her words a rasping whisper. One of the men, tall and with a face half covered by a mask, grinned at her. His eyes were cold, devoid of any emotion. "You should have stayed in the office," Viney said, "but now you'll die out here in the quiet." Eve's heart raced. She knew what was happening. They were planning to leave her, let her die slowly, alone in the wilderness. No one would find her in time. Not here, not in this remote part of the forest. They had picked this place carefully. The sharp rocks below, the long drop to the jagged earth. Even if someone did happen to stumble upon her, the weather would take its toll. The cold would sap her strength, slowly killing her as the hours dragged on. The leader gave one last glance, as though to savor the moment. "Let's make it a quiet death. No noise, no trace," he murmured. With that, they pushed her forward, her body swaying as she teetered on the edge of the cliff. Her heart pounded in her chest as the realization set in. She was completely at their mercy. There was no backup, no escape. They tightened the rope around her waist, securing her to a nearby rock. For a moment, she swayed precariously, suspended in the open air, the drop below her an abyss. The weight of her body felt heavier, each breath shallow, as she realized there was no immediate way out. Time would be her enemy now, and it seemed, for the first time in a long while, that she was truly alone. Eve's body dangled precariously from the edge of the cliff, her arms and legs numb from hours of hanging, bound and exposed to the cold winds. The sun was dipping low, casting long, ominous shadows across the jagged rocks below, and she knew that nightfall would bring even greater dangers. The rope that held her suspended had rubbed her waist raw, and every breath felt like a fight. Her lips cracked from thirst, her throat dry and aching. She could feel the sweat on her skin turning cold, seeping into the fabric of her uniform, the chill of the night creeping in. The weight of exhaustion, dehydration, and fear was starting to take hold. It was only a matter of time before her strength failed, before the rope finally gave way or the cold overtook her. Her mind was numb, slipping between consciousness and delirium. She had no illusions left. The border patrol station was miles away, and there had been no signal. No one was coming. She was alone, alone in a vast wilderness that didn't care, with only the howling wind and her fleeting thoughts to keep her company. Then, suddenly, she heard a sound, a rustling from the trees, deep and heavy, like the earth itself was shifting. Eve's eyes fluttered open, her pulse quickening as she tried to focus on the movement at the edge of her vision. For a moment, she thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her arm. But then the sound grew louder, unmistakable. A massive shape emerged from the trees, and Eve's heart froze in her chest. 3 enormous grizzly bears, their thick fur matted with dust and the remnants of their travels, appeared on the other side of the cliff. The largest of the 3, a towering bear with dark brown fur and a broad, powerful body, stopped just short of the edge, its eyes narrowing as it studied her. Eve's breath caught in her throat. She had heard of bears in the area, but this was different. Her heart hammered in her chest. The sight of them filled her with primal fear, their sheer size and strength making her feel even smaller, even more vulnerable. She knew that she had to do something, anything to make them go away. But the fear gripped her, her voice lost, her body too weak to move. She watched, paralyzed, as the massive bear took a few slow steps toward her. The wind picked up, swirling dust and loose rocks, making Eve feel even more exposed. Her body swayed slightly with the breeze, the rope creaking ominously beneath her. The bear continued to approach, its paws making soft thuds against the earth, each step measured, deliberate. Then, to Eve's complete surprise, the bear, larger than anything she had ever imagined, reached forward with its powerful jaws. It extended its long, sharp teeth, but instead of attacking, the bear did something utterly unexpected. It grabbed the rope with a surprising delicacy, its claws not raking but pulling at the fibers of the cord holding her. Eve's mind screamed in disbelief. The rope was being cut. She couldn't comprehend it at first, her brain too slow to process what was happening. With a firm tug, the rope split. Eve felt the rope loosen from around her waist, and she gasped, her heart racing as she felt her body shift downward. But instead of falling, she was gently pulled up. The bear, with the help of the other 2 grizzlies, carefully hoisted her towards safety. The second grizzly, a slightly smaller but still massive creature, leaned forward to support her weight, its thick, muscled arms lifting her from the edge. Eve's breath came in short bursts as she was pulled over the rocky lip of the cliff. The world around her spun, and for a moment, she thought she might pass out. But then she was lying on solid ground, the rough texture of the stone beneath her skin. She could barely process it. The 3 grizzlies stood over her, their breath heavy, watching her with a mix of curiosity and caution. Her body ached as the adrenaline slowly wore off, but the relief of being out of danger was overwhelming. She reached out with trembling hands, her fingers grazing the thick fur of the largest bear. The black bear, who had pulled the rope and guided her to safety, stepped closer. There was a quiet, intense gaze between them, and Eve, exhausted and overcome with emotion, whispered, "Ada." The name came out without thought, as if it was meant to be. Her savior, her symbol of hope, the one who had defied instinct and risked everything to pull her from the brink of death. The bear's large amber eyes locked with hers for a moment, and in that silent connection, Eve felt an undeniable bond. Ada had saved her life, not just out of curiosity, but out of something more, something Eve couldn't yet understand but deeply appreciated. The other grizzlies, both male, towering and powerful, watched for a moment longer as if making sure Eve was safe. Then, with a final glance, Ada stepped back, allowing the two other bears to follow her into the forest. They didn't look back, but Eve knew they would be watching, guarding, and in some strange, profound way, protecting her. Ada had saved her, and in doing so had given Eve not just a second chance at life, but a new purpose. Eve lay in the quiet, sterile confines of the Border Patrol outpost's infirmary, her body wrapped in bandages, a steady drip of fluids keeping her alive after the grueling ordeal. The faint hum of the overhead lights was the only sound that broke the otherwise still air. Her body ached from the injuries she had sustained while dangling off the cliff, the rope biting into her skin and the cold gradually seeping into her bones. But she was alive. More than alive, she was awake, and her mind had already begun to piece together the fragmented memories of the attack. Through the small window of her room, Eve caught a glimpse of the sky turning a pale blue, the first signs of morning light spreading over the rugged Indiana landscape. Her eyes lingered on the horizon, but it wasn't the land that drew her attention. It was the large, dark figure standing just outside the infirmary door. The bear. Ada, the black grizzly who had pulled her to safety, was standing at the edge of the outpost, her massive form a sentinel against the rising sun. Eve's heart swelled with gratitude and something deeper, an understanding. Ada had saved her, and now, it seemed, the bear had chosen to remain by her side. Eve smiled faintly, though it hurt to do so, and she closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to drift in and out of sleep. But as much as Eve longed for the rest, something gnawed at the back of her mind. A slow realization had been forming, like a shadow creeping along the edge of her thoughts. She had been betrayed. It wasn't just an ambush, it was a setup. Her route, the one Supervisor Ryder Smith had given her, had been manipulated. Eve had been sent into the Devil's Backbone Cliff, knowing that it was a prime spot for an attack, but she hadn't seen the signs. Her fingers, stiff and bruised, reached for the paperwork that lay on the small table beside her bed. The maps, the intel, everything had seemed routine when she'd received the mission. But now, with clearer eyes and the sting of betrayal fresh on her mind, Eve could see the cracks. The notations on the map had been off, the coordinates in an area far too remote for a standard mission. The kind of place where she could be left to die, quietly and without witnesses. She inhaled sharply, her chest tight. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. She had been expendable to someone within the Border Patrol. Ryder Smith. The thought struck her like a blow to the chest. She knew he was hiding something, but now it was more than just a suspicion. Eve shifted in bed, wincing as the pain shot through her body. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was a survivor, and she needed answers. Ada's watchful eyes seemed to reassure her, and she knew that this bond, this strange alliance, would be her strength. With her body still weak, Eve had a long road ahead of her, but she was resolved. She would find out who was behind this betrayal, and when she did, they would face the consequences. Ada, standing guard outside the infirmary, would be the first to know. Together, they would uncover the truth. Eve sat at a small table in the Border Patrol outpost, papers spread out before her. The weight of her injuries still lingered, her muscles sore and stiff, but her mind was sharp. She had been given time to heal, but the more she thought about the events that had led to her near death, the more certain she became. Her mission had been deliberately set up to fail. The evidence was all there, scattered across the documents and maps. The mission route that had been assigned to her, mapped out by Supervisor Ryder Smith, led her straight into a dead zone, a place where communication was weak and help would never arrive in time. It wasn't a mistake. Someone had known exactly where to send her and why. Eve's fingers traced the lines on the map, the coordinates that had led her to the Devil's Backbone cliff. The realization hit her with a sickening clarity. Smith had orchestrated this. He had manipulated the mission, knowing she would be left exposed and vulnerable, with no way to call for backup. He had known she wouldn't come back from this one. Her heart burned with anger and betrayal. Smith had to be connected to the cartel, no doubt about it. He had been feeding information to criminals for months, maybe years, using his position within the Border Patrol to set up operations. Eve had walked right into his trap. She had been expendable to him. Ada, the black bear who had saved her life, now stood as a symbol of her survival. The bond between them had become something deeper, something more significant than she could have imagined. Ada had been her savior, but now she was her ally. Eve wasn't going to let Smith get away with this. She straightened in her chair, her resolve hardening. It was time to expose him. The day was cold, a chill that crept through the walls of the Border Patrol outpost, matching the tension that simmered in the air. Eve paced in her small office, the weight of the information she had gathered pressing on her mind. The truth was clear now. Supervisor Ryder Smith had betrayed her and her entire team. He had used his position to feed the cartel vital information, manipulating her mission route to leave her vulnerable and exposed. Now it was time to confront him. Eve could feel her pulse quicken as she walked through the hallways, the shadows growing longer with each step. She was no longer the quiet, haunted woman who had arrived at the outpost. The fire within her had ignited again, fueled by the truth and the betrayal she had suffered. Ada, ever watchful, followed her closely, a silent protector at her side. The bear's presence was a quiet strength, her steady gaze and powerful form a reminder that Eve was not alone in this fight. When Eve reached Smith's office, she found him seated at his desk, his back turned to her. He hadn't expected this confrontation. No one had. The tension in the room thickened, and for a moment Eve simply stood there watching him. Smith's posture was relaxed, too relaxed for someone who knew what was coming. He turned slowly in his chair, a smile curling at his lips. "You finally figured it out, didn't you?" Smith's voice was calm, almost mocking. "You've been digging around, asking questions, but you'll find that it's too late now." Eve didn't flinch. "I know everything," she said, her voice steady but laced with fury. "You sold us out to the cartel. You manipulated my mission, led me straight into a trap. And now I'm going to make sure you pay for it." Smith's smile faltered, and his hand moved toward the desk, fingers brushing over something hidden beneath the papers. Eve's instincts flared. Before she could react, Smith sprang from his chair, drawing a gun from the desk drawer. His eyes narrowed in a dangerous gleam. "You think you've won," he spat. "You're nothing but a pawn, just like everyone else in this system. But I'm not going down without a fight." Eve's hand went to the sidearm at her waist, but Smith was faster. He fired a shot, and Eve ducked behind the desk just in time, the bullet grazing the edge of her shirt. Her heart pounded, but her training took over. She knew how to handle situations like this. Ada, standing near the door, reacted instinctively. With a growl that rattled the walls, the bear lunged forward, knocking over the filing cabinets and charging toward Smith. Smith tried to level his gun at her, but the bear was too fast. Ada swiped at his arm, sending the gun flying across the room. Smith let out a curse, stumbling backward. The other agents in the outpost rushed in at Eve's signal. With their help, Smith was quickly overwhelmed. Despite his desperate thrashing, he was no match for Eve's training and the sheer force of the bear's presence. Within moments, Smith was pinned to the ground, handcuffed by one of the officers. Breathing heavily, Eve stood over him, her gaze unwavering. "You're done," she said, her voice cold with resolve. "This ends now." Smith's face twisted in a mixture of rage and defeat. "You think this is over?" he sneered. "The cartel will come for you. They'll burn everything down." Eve leaned in closer, her voice low and full of certainty. "Not if I have anything to say about it." With Smith in custody, the cartel's grip on the Border Patrol station was broken, but Eve knew the fight wasn't over. She had exposed the corruption within the system, but the ripple effects would be felt for months to come. As Smith was led away by the officers, Eve watched him with a quiet satisfaction, knowing that this chapter was closed. But the war wasn't over. The cartel still operated in the shadows, and there was much work left to do. As Eve turned to Ada, her eyes met the bear's steady gaze. "We've got more to do," she said softly. "But together, we'll stop them." Ada's soft snort was the only answer, but it was enough. The fallout from Ryder Smith's betrayal rippled through the border patrol station like an earthquake, leaving cracks in the foundation of an organization that once seemed invincible. News of the corruption spread quickly, and agents who had once trusted Smith found themselves questioning everything they had known. In the days following his arrest, many of them turned to Eve for answers, her calm demeanor and determination a source of strength for the outpost that had been rocked by such a shocking revelation. But even as the dust settled, Eve knew this was only the beginning. The cartel had been dealt a blow, but the fight wasn't over. There were still whispers of their influence, lurking in the shadows, and it would take more than a few arrests to rid the border of their presence. Eve was no longer just a border patrol agent. She had become something different. The days of quietly burying her past and blending into the station's routine were behind her. She had found a new purpose, one that didn't just involve protecting people, but also protecting the wild creatures who called the forest home. It was Ada, the grizzly bear who had saved her life, that had sparked this new direction. Ada had become a symbol, a living testament to the bond that could exist between humans and animals. When Eve had first been rescued, she hadn't fully understood the significance of the bear's actions. But as time passed, it became clear that the bear had not just been a rescuer, but a partner in a larger mission. Word spread quickly that Eve and Ada were working together. Other bears, drawn by Ada's presence, began to show curiosity, and Eve started to notice them more often around the outpost. Some were smaller, others bigger, but each seemed to have a sense of trust in her that she hadn't expected. The wildness of the bears was not something she could tame, but there was a growing understanding between them, a silent agreement that they were allies in a much larger fight. At first, there were doubts among her colleagues. Some questioned the practicality of working with wild animals, let alone a team of them. But as Eve and Ada helped patrol the most remote and dangerous stretches of the border, it became clear that this unconventional team was something special. The bears' ability to navigate the dense, rugged terrain was unparalleled, and their presence deterred smugglers and cartel members from even thinking about crossing into the territory. Eve spent her days training the bears, watching them develop their own unique abilities. Some showed remarkable intelligence, while others relied on their raw strength. Together, they formed a team that was greater than the sum of its parts, a team where trust and respect between species were paramount. But the real change was within Eve herself. No longer just a soldier driven by duty and revenge, she found herself becoming a protector, not just of human lives, but of the wild animals that shared the land with them. The forest had once been a place of isolation and pain, but now it felt like home. Every step she took alongside the bears was a step towards something greater than the war she had fought in the past. Eve's new role wasn't easy. There were still challenges, still dangers lurking at the border. But with Ada at her side and the growing team of wild bears, she knew she could face whatever came next. The betrayal she had endured had been painful, but it had led her to this new beginning, one where she could find peace in protecting both human and animal lives. As Eve stood at the edge of the forest, looking out over the vast expanse of land that stretched before her, she knew she was no longer alone. The forest was alive, not just with the creatures she had once fought to protect, but with the bond she had forged with Ada and the wild bears who had joined her. This was the start of a new chapter, one where the lines between protector and protected, human and animal, were no longer so clearly drawn. "Together," Eve whispered, her voice carried away by the wind, "we'll keep this land safe." Ada stood beside her, the bear's dark eyes fixed on the horizon. A soft growl rumbled in her chest, the sound of agreement. It was a new beginning for both of them. And in this wild, unforgiving world, Eve had found a family. As the seasons passed and the winds of change swept across the Indiana forest, Eve George found herself in a place she never thought possible. The woman who had once carried the weight of betrayal, loss, and the scars of war now stood as a beacon of resilience, not just for the men and women of the Border Patrol, but for the wild creatures she had once believed were beyond her reach. Her journey, marked by the painful echoes of her past, had led her to something far greater than survival. It had led her to a bond with Ada, the grizzly bear whose silent strength and unexpected loyalty had shown her that redemption was not just for humans. Together they had forged a path where fear and doubt no longer held sway, replaced by trust, partnership, and the quiet understanding that survival was not an individual endeavor. It was a shared one. The forest, once a place of solitude and heartache, had become her sanctuary. With every step she took alongside Ada and the growing team of wild bears, Eve realized that she was no longer the ghost ranger haunted by memories of her past missions. She had become something new, a protector of both the land and its creatures, a guide in a world where the lines between human and wild were becoming increasingly blurred. In her heart, Eve knew there would always be a part of her that carried the weight of what had been lost, the pain of the betrayal she had suffered. But now, as she watched Ada move gracefully through the trees, the sunlight catching the edges of her dark fur, Eve felt a deep sense of peace. She had found something worth fighting for, something that was bigger than herself. And as the sun set over the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor, Eve knew that this was only the beginning. Crying mother bear brings her dying cub to a man. What he does next is unbelievable. At dawn, the Adirondack Mountains exhaled mist like smoke from an ancient breath. Pines stood hushed and watchful, their branches dusted with the frost of early spring. And somewhere in the distance, a loon called out over the glassy surface of a hidden lake. Aidan Brody opened the creaking door of his cabin, expecting only the scent of pine sap and the chill of morning air. Instead, he froze, one hand still gripping the doorknob, his breath caught in his chest. On the porch, illuminated by the weak gold of sunrise, stood a bear. Not lumbering, not threatening, but still, rooted in a way that made time hesitate. Her massive body seemed carved from shadow and earth, her black coat mottled with gray, her ribs subtly visible beneath fur matted with mud and something darker. And in her mouth she held a cub, limp, unmoving. Aidan could see its tiny paws curled inward, its head lolling slightly to one side. A surge of panic rose in his throat. Fight or flight, the old human instinct screamed at him to back away slowly, close the door, call someone. But the bear didn't growl. She didn't shift. Her eyes, deep pools of raw and waiting grief, held him in place more firmly than any threat could have. With an uncanny deliberateness, she stepped forward, her breath visible in the chill, and laid the cub gently on the wooden porch. Then she sat back, the wood creaking under her weight, and did nothing, said nothing, just watched. Aidan stood frozen in the doorway, heart pounding in his ears. His fingers were numb, not from the cold, but from disbelief. He had seen a lot in his years as a journalist, wars, revolutions, human tragedy of every stripe. But never this, never a mother of the wild placing her child in the care of a man. She didn't ask, she simply trusted. He stepped slowly forward, kneeling before the cub, who was hardly the size of a loaf of bread. Its breathing was shallow, its chest barely moving. Blood crusted the fur around one ear. Wounds, ragged and torn, lined its tiny flank, too small to survive another hour in the cold. Jesus, Aidan whispered, his voice breaking the stillness. The mother bear blinked but didn't flinch. Her muscles, taut beneath her ragged coat, didn't twitch. Aidan reached for the cub with cautious hands, moving in the way you might approach something divine. As his fingers touched the soft, damp fur, the cub let out the faintest sigh, a sound like the rustle of leaves, and Aidan's heart clenched. Without a word, he lifted it, holding the fragile body close to his chest, feeling the faint beat of life struggling against the chill. He stood slowly and backed toward the cabin, leaving the door open behind him. The mother bear did not follow. She remained where she was, massive and unmoving, the mountain's shadow given breath. Inside, the cabin was dim, warmed only by the embering fire in the hearth. Aidan set the cub on a stack of folded towels and rushed to grab the small space heater he rarely used. He placed it beside the cub and turned the dial, praying it wouldn't blow a fuse. Then, in a rush of instinct and memory, he fetched honey from the pantry, mixing it with warm water in a chipped mug. He dipped the corner of a cloth in the mixture and gently pressed it to the cub's mouth. At first, nothing. Then a flicker. The tongue, tiny and pink, brushed weakly against the fabric. Outside, the bear remained, watching through the window. Her eyes, dark as the depths of a well, met Aiden's. They said nothing. They asked for nothing. And yet, they spoke of everything. He found the old rotary phone Emma had insisted on keeping, its cord tangled behind a dusty bookshelf. His fingers dialed the number of Rachel Bloom, the only vet within 30 miles. She had once stitched up a wounded deer in his driveway. "Rachel," he said when she answered, "I need you to come. It's urgent." "What's wrong?" she asked, already moving into action. "A cub," he said. "Bear cub, injured. On my porch. The mother—" He paused. "She brought it to me." There was silence then. "I'm on my way." Aiden returned to the cub, sitting beside it as the heater hummed softly. He watched the steam rise from the cloth and let the minutes pass like falling leaves. His hands, calloused from chopping wood and writing in solitude, moved gently over the cub's tiny frame. He whispered nothing, only breathed beside the small body, as if his warmth alone might be enough. Hours slipped by, the sun rising higher in the sky. The bear outside never moved, not even when crows flew overhead or squirrels darted across the porch rail. Her vigil was absolute. Rachel arrived just before noon, her truck crunching down the gravel path like a sound from another world. She burst into the cabin with her med kit slung over one shoulder, hair tied back in a hasty braid. Her eyes widened as they landed on the cub, then on the shadow beyond the window. "You weren't kidding," she murmured, kneeling. She examined the cub with professional hands, her brow creasing. "Bite wounds. Could be from another male. This happens when they want to eliminate competition." Aiden's stomach turned. He looked toward the mother bear, who still hadn't moved. She must have fought him off, took the cub and ran. Rachel nodded, injecting the cub with antibiotics and pain meds. "She trusts you," she said quietly, not looking at him. "That doesn't happen. Not like this." "I know," Aiden whispered. As the afternoon waned, Rachel left, promising to return with supplies. Aiden stayed with the cub, feeding it drop by drop, keeping its tiny form near the heater. Outside, the bear shifted for the first time, just a little, repositioning herself, but never left. He made tea. He sat by the window. He waited. And as dusk turned the sky to ash, the cub whimpered, a soft, trembling sound, and opened its eyes. Aiden felt tears prick his own. "You're not done yet, little guy," he murmured, voice breaking. Behind him, the bear exhaled a breath he could almost hear through the glass, like a sigh of something ancient. Grief, hope, gratitude. He didn't know which, maybe all of it. That night, he slept by the cub, blanket wrapped around them both, the space heater glowing beside them. The bear watched through the window, her silhouette dark against the stars. Aiden dreamed of pine needles, of snowmelt, of paws pressing into the soft earth. He dreamed of trust, and for the first time in a very long time, he did not dream of loss. The morning after Baxter opened his eyes, the world outside Aiden's cabin seemed to hold its breath. A curtain of fog clung to the forest, draping the trees in a veil of silver silence. The cub had survived the night, barely, but survival, Aiden knew, was never a guarantee. He woke with a start, the weight of his flannel blanket half off his shoulders, the space heater still buzzing a low, steady hum. Baxter, he had whispered the name sometime in the early hours, unthinking, natural, like the name had always belonged to the little creature now curled against his leg, stirred, lifting his head with a groggy softness. His eyes, still dulled with exhaustion, blinked slowly before closing again. Outside the frosted window, the mother bear sat unmoving, her breath puffing in rhythmic clouds. Aiden rose quietly, easing his aching knees and stiff shoulders into motion. His body wasn't used to sleeping on the floor anymore, but he didn't mind. He brewed coffee in Emma's battered percolator, its metallic hiss and bubble familiar and grounding. As he stood at the counter, watching the sun try to break through the trees, he glanced out the window again. She hadn't moved, not even once. Something deep inside him shifted at the sight, a mixture of awe, fear, and a quiet ache he hadn't known still lingered. That kind of loyalty, that stillness and waiting, it reminded him of hospital nights, of holding Emma's hand while the world outside continued without them. And now, again, the world had paused for something small and fragile to live. He carried the coffee back to Baxter and crouched beside him, dipping a clean cloth into honeyed water and pressing it gently to the cub's cracked lips. A flick of the tongue, A swallow. He felt a flicker of hope. That was when he heard tires crunching gravel. Rachel. She stepped into the cabin with a gust of cold air and a duffel bag slung over her shoulder. Her eyes went immediately to the cub. "Still hanging on?" she asked, already crouching beside Aiden. "He's stronger today," Aiden murmured. Rachel smiled, though it was faint. "You named him?" "Baxter," he said softly. Rachel nodded as she examined the cub, checking the wounds, the paws, the tiny ribs beneath his fur. "Not out of the woods yet," she said, "but he's fighting, and so are you." They didn't speak much as Rachel cleaned the wounds more thoroughly, administered a second dose of antibiotics, and left instructions for hydration and feeding. She promised to return again the following day and left behind a stack of gauze, antiseptic, and a powdered milk substitute made for orphaned wildlife. Aiden walked her to her truck. Before she left, she paused, hand on the door. "You know this isn't legal," she said, her voice low, not accusing, just factual. "Technically, you're harboring a wild animal. Wildlife services won't see the nuance. You could get fined or worse." "I know," Aiden said, his hands in his coat pockets. "But she brought him to me. What was I supposed to do?" Rachel nodded once. "Just be careful. I'll cover for you as long as I can." After she left, the quiet returned. Baxter slept most of the day, waking only for water and the occasional weak twitch of a paw as if he were dreaming. Aiden stayed by his side, reading aloud from a tattered paperback of The Old Man and the Sea. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because it was a story about something wild and immense that refused to be conquered. Maybe because Emma had always loved it. Outside, the mother bear remained. She never approached, never left, never turned away. Just watched. Days passed, then a week. Baxter grew stronger. His fur, once matted and dulled, began to regain a soft sheen. His tiny legs carried him a few feet at a time now. He'd wobble across the room, collapse beside the heater, and blink up at Aiden like a tired toddler. Aiden, despite every logical voice screaming at him, began to laugh again. He built a small playpen with spare firewood and blankets so Baxter could move around without hurting himself. He found himself making up lullabies again. Old nonsense songs Emma used to sing while folding laundry, and Baxter would listen, ears twitching. Rachel continued to visit, now bringing fresh greens, calcium supplements, and checklists from her friend Ginny Mallard, a wildlife specialist who had started advising from afar. Ginny, though hesitant, admitted the cub's survival was remarkable. "But," she said over the phone one night, her voice firm, "he needs to be rewilded. Bonding with humans too long could ruin his chance at survival. Bears are not pets." Aiden understood. And yet, each night he looked at the cub curled in front of the fire, and his heart rebelled against reason. He had lost so much. Was it so wrong to want to keep this one small thing alive and close and safe? The mother bear began to disappear for hours at a time, returning before dusk. Aiden suspected she was hunting, reclaiming her strength. But every evening, without fail, she would return and sit at the edge of the clearing like a shadow stitched to the earth. And every time she did, Aiden's chest ached with something he could not name. Baxter began responding to the sounds outside, the rustling of trees, the calls of distant birds. One morning he sat by the door and stared at the world beyond the porch like he remembered it from a dream. Aiden watched him quietly. "You miss it, don't you?" he said. "I think you know where you belong." The thought stayed with him, and it festered. One afternoon, while splitting firewood, he saw a government SUV parked at the base of the trail. A figure stood by it, talking on a radio. Wildlife Services. Aiden's stomach twisted. That evening, Rachel confirmed it. "They're tracking reports," she said. "You need to make a decision. Now." Aiden nodded but said nothing. That night, Baxter fell asleep in Aiden's lap, his round body warm and breathing in rhythm with the quiet thud of Aiden's heart. Outside, the bear stood beneath the moonlight, her silhouette still as the pines. Aiden whispered into the darkness, more to himself than anyone else. "You trusted me to help him, and I did, but I don't know how to say goodbye." The wind didn't answer, but something in the stillness seemed to understand. The next morning, he packed a knapsack. Honey, a worn towel, a piece of the old quilt Emma had sewn, and the tiny carved whistle Emma once gifted him, meant for wolves, though he'd never used it. He bundled Baxter in a lined crate and loaded it into the truck. The road was long, winding, barely more than a trail in places, and his hands trembled on the wheel. At a clearing near the old riverbed, he stopped. Trees towered around him like ancient sentinels. The air smelled of moss and bark. He opened the crate. Baxter blinked up at him, unsure. "Go on," Aiden whispered. "She's waiting." And from the trees she emerged. The mother bear, quiet as dusk, stepped into the clearing. Aiden's breath caught in his throat. She made no sound. She did not approach him. She only waited. Baxter took a hesitant step toward her, then another, then ran. She met him halfway, nuzzling him, circling around him, and then she turned to Aiden, and she looked at him. Not with fear, not with suspicion, but with something that almost felt like thanks. And then she turned, and with her cub trailing close behind, she vanished into the trees. Aiden stood alone in the clearing. The world was silent. He felt no relief, no pride, just the raw, aching stretch of love learning to let go. The wind picked up, pine needles swirled, and Aiden, heart torn open and stitched anew, all in the same breath, whispered, "Goodbye, Baxter. Be wild." The next few days settled into a rhythm that felt both surreal and sacred. Aiden rose before the sun, checking on Baxter first, careful not to disturb the cub's shallow breaths as he adjusted the old space heater and warmed a fresh batch of honey water. Outside, the mother bear remained rooted near the edge of the trees, never too far, always watching. She no longer sat stiffly on the porch, but instead had taken to resting just beyond the clearing, her dark shape barely discernible beneath the boughs of a pine. Sometimes Aiden would see her lift her head at the sound of the cabin door, her eyes meeting his before returning to her silent vigil. He wondered if she slept at all. Each day, Baxter grew stronger. The gashes along his side, once angry and red, began to close under Rachel's careful guidance. She stopped by every other morning now, always arriving with a thermos of chamomile tea and a new supply of syringes, antiseptic, or powdered milk supplement. "He's going to make it," she said on the fifth morning, brushing the back of her hand against Baxter's soft fur. "He's a fighter. So are you, apparently." Aiden gave a tired smile. He hadn't left the property since the bear first arrived. His shelves were running low, owing. No more eggs, no more oats, but he couldn't bring himself to drive into town. The idea of leaving the cub, even for an hour, felt like abandoning something sacred. "You're imprinting," Rachel said gently as she watched him stir warm formula on the stove. "Or maybe he is. You know what Jenny would say." "That this ends badly if I don't let go," Aiden replied without looking up. "I remember." Rachel sighed. "You should call her." Aiden hesitated. He hadn't spoken to Jenny Mallard in years, not since he'd written a piece about her controversial bear rehabilitation work for Mountain Voice Weekly. She had been kind, brilliant, and wildly unpopular with hunters and politicians alike. She also didn't trust easily. But he called her that night. Her voice, low and measured, answered on the second ring. "It's been a while, Brody," she said. "I read your piece. You made me sound noble. I hated it." "I need your help," he said simply. Then he told her everything. When he finished, Jenny was quiet. He imagined her sitting at her desk, the phone wedged between her shoulder and cheek, her fingers tracing the grain of a scarred wood surface, as she thought. "If the mother's still out there and still watching, this is different," she said finally. "Very different. She's not rejecting him. She's trusting you to heal him. That's rare." "So what do I do?" he asked. "Keep him alive. Don't get too close. And when he can walk, eat on his own, and follow a scent trail, you let him go. And if I can't, then you'll raise a bear in your cabin until the state takes him from you. And that won't end well for either of you." Aiden hung up with a knot in his chest. That night, Baxter whimpered in his sleep, pawing gently at the quilt Aiden had laid over him. His fur was starting to fill in again, a soft cinnamon brown that reminded Aiden of the forest floor in early autumn. He sat beside him, hand resting lightly on the cub's back, feeling the rise and fall of its breath. He thought of Emma, of the nights he had sat like this in the hospital room, watching the quiet rhythm of machines, each beep a reminder that time was slipping. And yet here, now, something was being restored. It was impossible not to feel that. By the end of the first week, Baxter could stand. He wobbled at first, legs unsteady, but his determination outmatched his weakness. Aiden fashioned a small pen in the living room with logs and cushions, giving the cub room to stretch and stumble. Rachel cheered quietly the first time Baxter made it 3 steps without toppling. "You're not going to want to let him go," she said, crouching beside Aiden as they watched the cub gnaw clumsily on a corner of firewood. "You already know that, don't you?" "He's not mine to keep," Aiden said, the words tasting both true and painful. "But he's part of something. And maybe that something includes me. Just for now." That afternoon, Aiden left the cabin door open. For the first time in days, he stepped outside onto the porch, with Baxter wrapped in a blanket against his chest. The cold stung his cheeks, but Baxter seemed alert, nose twitching as he sniffed the air. The mother bear appeared from the tree line within minutes. She moved cautiously, her weight shifting with slow grace as she approached the edge of the clearing. She did not come closer than 20 feet. Aiden sat on the steps, heart pounding, and held Baxter against his shoulder. "He's getting better," he called softly. "You did the right thing." The mother bear stood still, wind brushing her fur like fingers through grass. Her eyes found his. There was no sound, only the hush of pine needles in the breeze and the slow, careful breathing of the cub in his arms. After a while, she turned and disappeared into the trees. Aiden remained on the porch long after she was gone. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept listening for sounds outside, kept replaying the look she'd given him. It hadn't been fear. It hadn't even been desperation. It was trust. And trust, he thought, was heavier than grief. He dreamed of a forest trail blanketed in fallen leaves, and of a bear walking beside him, silent and immense, their footsteps falling in rhythm. Morning brought clouds and the smell of snow. Baxter was more restless now, testing the limits of his enclosure, nosing through the firewood stack, batting at a tangle of rope like a kitten. Aiden watched him from the table where he was supposed to be writing but hadn't typed a word in days. Emma's photo sat beside the old typewriter, a picture of her with wind in her hair, laughing on the edge of a lake. "He's not mine," he whispered to her smile, "but I think I was meant to find him." Outside, a light dusting of snow began to fall. Aiden stepped out briefly and saw the outline of the mother bear's tracks near the edge of the porch. She had come again in the night, come and gone without a sound, just watching, just waiting, just hoping, perhaps, that what was broken could be mended. Aiden closed the door gently behind him, the cold still clinging to his skin. He turned back to the fire, to the cub nestled beside it, and knew without doubt that he was holding something rare, something wild, something borrowed, but not yet returned, not yet. Winter softened its grip by the third week, though the Adirondack air still carried a sting that reminded Aiden spring had not yet fully arrived. The snow around the cabin had begun to melt into slush, revealing the pine needle floor of the forest in patchy, soggy glimpses. Icicles clung to the edges of the eaves like stubborn fingers, dripping slowly, rhythmically, as if counting down. Inside the cabin, Baxter was no longer the limp, half-breathing creature left on the porch. He was bold now, almost mischievous, a creature full of energy and curiosity. He had taken to tugging on Aiden's bootlaces and rolling under the table where Aiden had tried and failed to finish a sentence in weeks. The bear cub would tumble out again moments later, eyes bright, a smudge of ash on his nose, or a scrap of newspaper stuck to his fur. Aiden laughed more often now, not the dry, hollow sound of politeness, but a laugh from somewhere deep and long forgotten. And yet, beneath each chuckle lived a quiet ache, because the better Baxter got, the closer the end came. Rachel's visits grew shorter, her words fewer. There wasn't much more she could do. Baxter no longer needed the formula or the heat lamp or even the towel-lined box Aiden had prepared with such care. He had outgrown the pen. He had begun to sniff at the door. Not at Aiden, not at the couch or the food bowls. At the door. That was what told Aiden the time had come. That and the absence. The mother bear hadn't returned for 2 days now. Her watchfulness, once so consistent and sacred, had slipped into silence. Aiden stared out into the woods for long stretches, the same way he had stared out hospital windows during the days before Emma died, waiting for something he could not name to arrive. Hope? Closure? A sign? He wasn't sure what he wanted now. But when Baxter, larger and heavier now, placed both front paws on the cabin door one morning and whined, not with pain or need but with longing, Aiden understood. That night he sat by the fire, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea, while Baxter slept curled against the hearth, his breath steady and warm. "You were never mine to keep," Aiden whispered. His voice barely stirred the air. The next morning he packed a small bag. Just a few things, though he doubted the cub would care. A cloth from the quilt he had slept on, a tiny carved whistle Aiden had meant to use to call for help once, but never had, and a piece of dried apple wrapped in wax paper. The sun rose slowly, casting long, amber fingers through the thinning trees. Aiden loaded Baxter into the truck with some difficulty. The cub had grown, heavier and awkward, still unsure of his balance on sloped surfaces. As they drove, Baxter rested his chin on the seat, his eyes fixed not on Aiden, but on the passing trees. The road narrowed the deeper they went. No cell signal, no markers, just the rhythm of gravel beneath tires and the looming hush of pine on either side. Aiden stopped in a clearing he had visited once with Emma, long ago during a fall hike, before loss had hollowed out his world. The forest here was old and quiet. Aiden stepped out, opened the door for Baxter, and let the cub climb down on his own. He carried the bag over one shoulder and walked slowly into the woods, glancing over his shoulder every few paces to make sure Baxter followed. He did, waddling with determination, stopping only to sniff a broken log or investigate a trail of scat. They walked until Aiden reached the edge of a shallow stream. He stopped there, the water gurgling gently over smooth rocks, and set the bag down. Baxter nosed beside him, brushing against his knee. Aiden crouched, unwrapped the apple slice, and placed it on a stone near the water. "This is it, little guy," he murmured. "This is where I leave you." Baxter sat, tilting his head, blinking slowly. Aiden placed the whistle on the ground beside the apple, then rested a hand on the cub's back. He wanted to say more, to explain the ache in his chest, the gratitude, the heartbreak, but he knew Baxter didn't need words. He only needed permission. "Go on," Aiden said quietly. "She'll find you." He stood slowly, took one step back, then another. And when Baxter didn't move, Aiden turned and walked. He didn't look back. Couldn't. He walked until he reached the truck. His hands trembled as he opened the door. It wasn't until he sat behind the wheel that he let the first tear fall. He let it fall without shame. He drove home in silence. The cabin was unbearably quiet that first night. The heater's hum sounded loud and hollow. The fire seemed too bright without a small body curled beside it. Aiden couldn't sleep. He sat in Emma's chair with the old blanket over his knees and stared at the door, not expecting it to open, not really knowing what he wanted anymore. The next day was no easier, nor the next. He swept the floors, washed Baxter's old towel, stacked the firewood without thinking. A few friends from town called to check in, but he didn't answer. Even Rachel's texts went unread. Then, 5 days after the goodbye, he found it, on the porch. Not a knock, not a sound, just a gift. A pile of pine cones, stacked neatly in a little pyramid, beside a cluster of red berries in a single stone, worn smooth by the river. Aiden stared at it for a long time before kneeling to touch the stone. It was cool to the touch, heavy with meaning. He looked out into the trees but saw nothing. Still he whispered, "Thank you." More days passed. More gifts followed. A scrap of moss that smelled like cedar. A feather striped with silver. A shard of bark with claw marks etched into it, deep and deliberate. And slowly the silence of the cabin became something else. Not emptiness, reverence. The forest had returned to its rhythm, and Aiden had found his place in it. He began writing again. Short things at first, descriptions of wind through fir branches. A sentence about the way Baxter used to sneeze when he drank too fast. A memory of Emma, holding a fern leaf like a fan and laughing. Eventually those words became a story of a mother who trusted a stranger, a cub who lived, a man who healed. And in the telling of it, Aiden began to heal too. Seasons turned. The porch gifts continued, always in autumn, always quiet and small and perfect. He never saw the bear again, but he never needed to. Their bond remained, sacred and unseen, a whisper through the trees, a breath in the fog, a memory left on the threshold of a man who had once believed he was finished, and now knew he never really would be.